Oh, no, you don't want her in the photo. Celeste laughed as she said it, light and silver, the laugh that had charmed every magazine in the city, and she steered the photographer's lens away from Dahlia with one manicured hand. That's just my assistant. She fetches the fabric swatches, bless her. Talented people come in all shapes, but the camera— a delicate pause, a flick of her eyes down Dahlia's body and back up, performed for the gathered press. The camera has its own preferences, doesn't it? Darling, why don't you go make sure the back room is tidy? The reporters chuckled, the flashbulbs turned away, and Dahlia Rourke, standing in the middle of a launch party celebrating a collection that had moved the entire industry to tears, looked at the woman taking a bow for it and said, very quietly, so only Celeste could hear, "The hidden seam on the evening wear, the one the critics are calling a miracle. Tell me how you did it." A beat. You don't know, do you? Because you've never held the pattern in your life. And across the room, a man who had come to that party for an entirely different reason set down his glass and began, for the first time all night, to pay attention. The collection was called Ascension, and it had made Celeste Vance the most celebrated designer in the city. The critics had wept. The buyers had emptied their accounts. A gown from that collection had walked a red carpet 2 weeks ago and broken the internet. And the woman whose name was stitched into every label, whose face filled every magazine, whose silver laugh filled this room, Celeste Vance, had not designed a single stitch of it. She had not drawn one line. She had not chosen one fabric. She could not, if you put a pattern and a pair of shears in front of her, have produced so much as a pillowcase. Every piece in Ascension had been designed by the heavy-set woman she'd just sent to tidy the back room. Dahlia Rourke was a big woman, and she was, by a distance that wasn't close, the most gifted designer of her generation. She understood fabric the way a composer understands sound, how a bias cut would fall before it was cut, how a seam could lie or tell the truth, how to build a garment that made a body look like the best version of itself instead of an apology for not being another body. She had spent 15 years developing a gift that the fashion world, by every signal it had ever sent her, had no intention of ever letting her show its face. And so Dahlia had made a decision years ago that she did not regret and had never once mistaken for shame. If the industry would judge her body before it ever looked at her work, then she would not give it the chance. She would let it fall in love with the work first. She would simply make sure the work arrived wearing a face the industry had already decided it was allowed to admire. That face was Celeste. The arrangement had been simple once and mutual. Dahlia designed, Celeste fronted, and the world got the clothes without the inconvenience of having to look at the woman who made them. Dahlia had walked into it with her eyes wide open. It was, she'd told herself, a cheat code, a way to win a rigged game without begging the people who'd rigged it to change the rules. She kept creative control. She kept her dignity. She kept, most of all, the private, unkillable knowledge that every gasp in every front row in this city was, in the end, hers. What she had not accounted for, what she was only beginning that night to understand, was that a lie you build to protect yourself becomes, over enough years, a cage someone else holds the key to. Because Celeste had stopped being a partner some time ago. Celeste had started believing her own legend. And lately, Dahlia had begun to notice things that had nothing to do with credit and everything to do with money. Numbers that didn't add up, fabrics ordered and never delivered, a quiet bleeding somewhere in the house's accounts that she wasn't supposed to be able to see. Celeste wasn't just taking the applause anymore. Celeste was taking something else, from someone else, and Dahlia was the perfect person to pin it on if it ever came to light. The invisible woman whose hands were on everything and whose name was on nothing. And the man who had just set down his glass across the room, the silent investor whose money kept this glittering house standing, the dangerous man who had come tonight because his clean, profitable little fashion label had quietly started losing money it had no reason to lose. was watching the assistant who'd just identified a seam its supposed designer couldn't explain. Marco Devereaux did not know her name yet, but he had spent 20 years learning to find the one person in any room who actually knew how things worked. And he had just found her, sending fabric swatches to the back, in a dress 2 sizes too modest for the talent coming off her like heat. To understand how the most gifted designer of her generation ended up tidying a back room while another woman took her bow, you have to go back 12 years, to a younger Dahlia Rourke, a portfolio full of genius, and a fashion world that took one look at her and shut every door it had. She had tried it the honest way first. Of course she had. She'd graduated top of her program, her final collection so far beyond her classmates that one instructor had called it frightening. And she had walked that portfolio into every great house in the city, and she had watched, over and over, the same thing happen. The slow drop of the eyes, the recalculation behind the smile, the way a room that had been excited by her sketches went cool the moment it met the woman who'd drawn them. They never said it. They were far too well-mannered to say it. They said the line wasn't the right fit for the brand, that the aesthetic was not quite our customer, that they'd keep her in mind. And Dahlia, who had been reading rooms her whole life, heard underneath all of it the one thing none of them would speak aloud. A woman who looks like you cannot be the face of beautiful things. It does not matter how beautiful the things are. She could have broken on that. A lot of people would have. Instead, Dahlia had done something colder and far more interesting. She had accepted the rule, and then she had decided to beat it. If the gatekeepers could not see past a body to a gift, then she would simply not show them the body. She would show them the gift alone, naked of the thing they used to dismiss it, and let it win on its own terms. She was not hiding because she was ashamed. She was hiding the way a sniper hides, because the shot lands better when the target never sees where it came from. Celeste had been the answer. They'd met young, 2 women on opposite sides of the same unfair coin. Dahlia, all talent and no face the industry would accept. Celeste, all face and a talent that ran about as deep as a saucer. The arrangement had made a brutal kind of sense. Celeste had the look the cameras wanted, willowy, photogenic, effortlessly the picture of what a designer was supposed to be. Dahlia had everything that actually mattered and none of the packaging. So they'd struck a bargain. Dahlia would design, Celeste would be the face, and they'd split the proceeds of a world that would never have bought the truth. For a while, it had even felt like friendship. For a while, it had worked. And the work, God, the work had been extraordinary. Freed from ever having to stand in front of it, Dahlia had designed like something unleashed. Collection after collection, each one better than the last, the house climbing from a rented studio to a flagship on the most expensive street in the city. Ascension was the peak of it. 12 years of a hidden genius pouring everything she had into clothes the world received as miracles. Dahlia had stood in the back at every show, watching the front rows weep over her work under another woman's name, and had told herself every single time that the private knowing was enough, that she didn't need them to see her, that she had outsmarted a cruel game, and that was its own kind of victory. But a cage is a cage, even a gilded one you built yourself. And somewhere in the last year, the bars had started to show. It was the money Dahlia noticed first, because Dahlia noticed everything. The same merciless eye that caught a crooked seam at 40 paces did not switch off when it wandered over a ledger. Fabric orders for quantities the collections didn't use, invoices to suppliers she'd never heard of, a second set of sample garments produced on the quiet in her designs that never appeared on any runway she knew about. And Celeste, who 12 years ago had been a grateful partner, had become something else entirely. Imperious, secretive, surrounded by new people who looked at Dahlia the way you look at a piece of furniture that started talking. Celeste had stopped sharing the proceeds fairly somewhere back. Now, Dahlia was beginning to suspect, Celeste had stopped sharing the truth at all. Because here was the thing that had started keeping Dahlia awake. Her designs were being made into garments she'd never authorized, and those garments were going somewhere. Sold privately, off the books, to someone. And the money from them was vanishing into the same fog the house's accounts had started leaking into. Celeste wasn't just stealing credit anymore. Celeste was running something through the house, something with real money behind it. Something with the particular careful smell of a scheme too sophisticated and too well-funded to be the work of a woman who couldn't sew a button. And Dahlia, the invisible designer whose hands touched every piece and whose name appeared on nothing, was the single most convenient person alive to hang it on if it ever unraveled. What Dahlia did not know, what she could not have known, standing in the back room of that launch party while the world toasted her stolen work, was that the money bleeding out of the house had an owner, a silent one, a dangerous one. The flagship on the most expensive street in the city, the glittering label, the whole beautiful machine. It had been built, quietly, on the investment of a man who did not advertise his involvement, who valued the house precisely because it was supposed to be clean, and who had just discovered that his clean, profitable little jewel was hemorrhaging money it had no business losing. His name was Marco Devereaux. He had come to the launch party to find out who was robbing him, and he had left it that night, having instead found the one person in that gilded room who didn't fit. A heavy-set assistant who could explain a seam its celebrated designer couldn't, sent to tidy the back while a woman with no talent took a bow. Marco Devereaux had not survived 20 years by ignoring things that didn't fit. By the next morning, he had a name. And by the morning after that, he had arranged, very quietly, to meet Dahlia Rourke. The meeting was arranged the way Marco Devereaux arranged everything. Quietly, on his terms, in a place Dahlia didn't choose. A car simply arrived at her building 2 mornings later, and the driver said only that someone who admired her work would like a word. Dahlia, who had spent 12 years being no one, understood at once that being recognized was its own kind of danger. She got in anyway. She'd grown very tired lately of the back room. He met her in an empty restaurant he apparently owned, and he wasted none of her time. "I'm going to tell you 3 things," Marco said, "and then I'm going to ask you one. First, I know you designed Ascension, all of it. I had a tailor I trust examine the construction, and he told me that whoever built these understands fabric at a level that takes a lifetime, and that Celeste Vance has the hands of a woman who has never finished a hem. Second, I am the person whose money built the house you work for. Not a board, not a bank. Me. And third," his dark eyes settled on her, "someone inside that house is robbing me, carefully, through the books, and they have been for the better part of a year." He leaned back. "Now the question. You see everything in that place. You've seen this too. So why has the most gifted designer in the city said nothing while someone bleeds her own house dry?" Dahlia looked at him for a long moment, this dangerous, direct man who had seen through 12 years of careful invisibility in the space of one launch party, and made a decision she'd be unpacking for a long time afterward. She told him the truth. "Because the moment I say something," she said, "I become the suspect. Think about it the way I've had to. My hands are on every design. My access is total. My name is on nothing, which means I have no documented stake in this house, which means to anyone looking, I have motive and opportunity and no loyalty on paper. The invisible woman is always the easiest one to blame, Mr. Devereaux. I learned a long time ago that being unseen keeps you safe, right up until the moment someone needs a body to pin a crime on. And then, it's the most dangerous place in the room." She held his gaze. "I've been gathering quietly, not talking, because I am not going to walk into your investigation as its prime suspect. I'm going to walk in with proof." And then she showed him what 12 years of noticing everything had assembled. It was not, she made clear, about the credit. The credit was an old wound, and she'd made her peace with it. It was the money. She laid it out the way she laid out a collection, piece by piece, until the shape emerged. The fabric orders that exceeded what the runways consumed, the phantom suppliers, the second line of sample garments produced off the books in her own designs and shipped to addresses that led nowhere she could trace. Celeste is having my designs made into real garments, couture grade, the genuine article, in quantities no show accounts for, Dahlia said. And someone is selling them, privately, quietly, to buyers who pay couture prices for a Celeste Vance original and never know it touched a runway. The money comes back into the house's accounts looking like ordinary revenue, gets mingled with the real sales, and a portion of it disappears out the other side before anyone reconciles the books. She paused. I didn't understand what I was looking at first. Now I do. Someone is using your clean fashion house to wash dirty money and using my designs as the soap.
Marco went very still, and Dahlia watched the temperature of the man change, the easy directness hardening into something colder and far more dangerous. Because she had just told him the one thing a man who launders carefully through a legitimate front cannot afford to hear: that his clean jewel had been quietly turned dirty by someone else. That the very feature he'd paid for, its spotless legitimacy, had been weaponized into a machine for washing money that wasn't his, under his nose, in his house. Someone, he said slowly, is running their own wash through my front, using my legitimate house to clean money I never touched. Which means if it surfaces on me. On you, Dahlia agreed. And on me, in that order, because they'll need a hand to blame before they ever let it reach the owner. I'm the hand. I always have been. She closed the folder she'd brought. So you and I have the same problem from opposite ends, Mr. Devereaux. You want to know who's washing money through your house. I want to stop being the perfect person to hang it on. And neither of us can move against Celeste yet, because Celeste isn't smart enough to have built this. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and saying it made it solid. Dahlia had worked beside Celeste for 12 years. She knew exactly the shape of the woman's mind: vain, grasping, clever about people and cameras, and absolutely nothing else. Celeste can take credit for a dress she didn't make, Dahlia said. She's done it for over a decade. But a laundering scheme this clean, the phantom suppliers, the books mingled just right, the structure of it, that's not vanity. That takes real financial sophistication. Celeste is the face of this, the same way she's the face of my collections. She's wearing it. She didn't design it. She looked at Marco. Someone built this and put Celeste out front, exactly the way I built my collections and put Celeste out front. There's a designer behind the designer here, too. And until we know who's actually holding the needle, going after Celeste just warns the person who matters. And as Marco Devereaux looked at the heavy-set woman who had just out-analyzed a year of his own people's investigation in a single conversation, who had not only found the rot in his house, but understood its architecture better than he did, something shifted behind his eyes that had nothing to do with money, and that neither of them, yet, was prepared to name. He had come looking for the person robbing him. He had found, instead, the only person in the city who could help him stop it, and she had just made it unmistakably clear that she intended to do it on her own terms, or not at all. They worked at night after the house emptied, the only hours the invisible designer had ever been able to move freely through her own kingdom. Marco brought what his people had pulled from the financial side. Dahlia brought 12 years of knowing where every thread in that house led. And in the dark flagship, surrounded by mannequins wearing her stolen genius, they began, piece by piece, to map a crime. It was strange work, and it changed something between them, the way shared work in the small hours always does. Marco Devereaux had expected to manage her, to extract what the talented assistant knew and direct the investigation himself, the way he directed everything.
What he found instead was that he couldn't keep up with her unless he stopped managing and started listening. She read the financial trail like one of her own patterns, finding the seam where the fake revenue met the real, the precise stitch where clean money and dirty money had been sewn together so skillfully that his own forensic accountants had missed it. "There," she said, past midnight, tapping a column. "That's not a supplier. That's a mouth. Money goes in looking like a fabric payment and comes out the other side belonging to someone else. Whoever built this thinks like I do. They hid the real structure inside a boring one nobody bothers to look at. It's exactly what I did with Celeste. You make the lie sit inside something so unremarkable that people's eyes slide right off it." "You keep saying whoever built this," Marco observed. "You admire them." "I recognize them," Dahlia corrected. "It's not the same thing. I've spent 12 years being the genius nobody sees, hidden behind a pretty face that takes the bows. Somebody is running this scheme the exact same way. The real mind in the shadows, a vain puppet out front. I'd know that architecture anywhere." A dry, tired half-smile. "It takes one to find one, Mr. Devereaux. The invisible recognize each other. It's the one advantage we have over people like you, who've never had to disappear to survive." And that was how the talking started. The real talking. The kind that creeps in around 2 in the morning, when two careful people are too tired to keep their armor on. Marco asked her, at some point, why she'd never just walked away and started her own house under her own name. And Dahlia, who never answered that question honestly because no one had ever asked it like they wanted the real answer, gave him the real answer. "Because the day I put my name and my face on a label," she said, "is the day I find out for certain whether the world will buy beautiful things from a woman who looks like me. And as long as I never try, I never have to know." She turned a sketch over in her hands. "It's easier to be a secret success than a public failure. I made a cage and I called it a strategy, and most days I even believe me." She looked up. "You're the first person in 12 years I've said that out loud to. I have no idea why it's you." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm the first person in 12 years who looked at the work and went looking for you," he said. Marco asked her, at some point, why she'd never just walked away and started her own house under her own name. And Dahlia, who never answered that question honestly because no one had ever asked it like they wanted the real answer, gave him the real answer. "Because the day I put my name and my face on a label," she said, "is the day I find out for certain whether the world will buy beautiful things from a woman who looks like me. And as long as I never try, I never have to know." She turned a sketch over in her hands. "It's easier to be a secret success than a public failure. I made a cage and I called it a strategy, and most days I even believe me." She looked up. "You're the first person in 12 years I've said that out loud to. I have no idea why it's you." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm the first person in 12 years who looked at the work and went looking for you," he said. "Not the face on the label. The hand behind it. I didn't come find Celeste Vance. I came and found the woman in the back room because she was the only thing in that house that was real." He held her gaze, and there was nothing transactional in it, which was rarer for him than she could have known. "I spend my life surrounded by faces people put on for me. Do you understand how strange it is to sit across from someone who spent her whole life being the truth that hides behind the face? I know exactly what you are, Dahlia. I'm the last man in the world who'd mistake the mannequin for the designer." Something moved through Dahlia's chest that she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. The specific vertigo of being seen, fully, by someone who had every tool to see falsely and had chosen instead to find the real thing and look straight at it. She was a careful woman. She did not trust it, but she did not look away from it either. And in the dim light of the flagship, with her own designs standing guard around them like silent witnesses, something began that neither of them rushed, because they were both people who'd learned the hard way what happens when you grab at a thing before you understand it. But the work had a deadline neither of them set, because across the city, Celeste Vance had started to feel the floor move. She didn't know what exactly, but she'd noticed the silent investor asking questions, noticed him lingering at the launch, noticed, with the animal instinct of a woman whose whole life ran on reading the room, that her invisible designer had been summoned somewhere and come back changed. Celeste was not smart about fabric or money or much of anything that mattered, but she was very, very smart about threats to Celeste. And she went, that week, to the one person who'd built her a scheme she didn't understand and told them in a frightened whisper that the assistant was a problem, and that the investor was starting to look at the books, which meant the architect behind Celeste, the real hand, the mind in the shadows Dahlia had recognized without yet identifying, now knew two things: that Marco Devereaux was looking, and that the heavy-set designer in the back room, the perfect scapegoat, the woman whose hands were on everything and whose name was on nothing, had stopped being invisible at exactly the wrong moment. The scapegoat had found an ally with money and menace, and a frame that had been built patiently over a year was about to be deployed, fast, before the only two people who could see it finished putting it together. Dahlia felt it coming the way she felt a bad seam before it tore. "It's going to get loud soon," she told Marco, gathering the sketches as the sky outside the flagship windows began to gray. "Celeste's scared. Scared people move, and when they move, they're going to need this whole thing to land on someone who isn't them." She looked at the mannequins, at 12 years of her own hidden life standing silent in the dark. "On me. It's always been going to be me. The only question left is whether we're ready before they pull the trigger." They found the architect faster than they should have, which, Dahlia would realize too late, was the first thing wrong with it. The trail through the phantom suppliers finally resolved into a name: Julian Mercer, the house's chief financial officer. It fit so neatly, it was almost elegant. Mercer had built the books. Mercer had the financial sophistication the scheme required. The structuring, the mingled accounts, the phantom suppliers routed through shells only a finance man would know how to build. Mercer had been at the house for 6 years, had access to everything, and had, when Marco's people quietly pulled his records, exactly the kind of personal debt that turns a respectable executive into a launderer. He was the mind in the shadows. He was the hand that had built Celeste's cage the same way Celeste had built Dahlia's. It was clean. It was complete. It was, everyone agreed, the answer. Marco moved on it the way Marco moved on things, decisively. Within a day, Mercer was confronted, and Mercer, faced with a dangerous man and a wall of evidence, crumbled completely. He confessed to the structuring. He confessed to the phantom suppliers. He confessed to skimming, to building the shells, to washing money through the house's accounts. The relief in the room was enormous. Celeste's puppet master had a name and a face and a signed confession, and Dahlia was, at last, out from under the shadow of being the scapegoat. It was over. Marco even allowed himself, briefly, to look at Dahlia like a man who just cleared the path between them of its last obstacle. Except Dahlia wasn't relieved. Dahlia was reading Mercer's confession the way she read a garment, and the construction was wrong. "Whose money was he washing?" she asked, into the satisfied quiet. Everyone looked at her. "Mercer just confessed to building the machine," she said slowly. "I believe in. The structuring is his. The shells are his. That's real financial work, and Celeste couldn't do it, and neither could I. But a laundry only matters if there's dirty money going through it. Mercer built the washing machine. Where's the laundry? Whose dirty money is it? Because Julian Mercer is a salaried CFO with gambling debts. He didn't have millions of his own dirty money lying around to clean. Someone was paying him to wash theirs. He's not the architect." She set the confession down. "He's the plumbing. He built the pipes, but somebody else owns the water." The room's relief curdled, exactly as it had the night Sophia, except this was Marco's world, not a hospital, and the implications were colder. Because Dahlia was right, and the moment she said it, it was obvious. Mercer had the skill to build the scheme. He did not have the product, the dirty money that needed cleaning.
And couture garments made off the books, sold privately for cash to anonymous buyers, were a perfect laundering vehicle for exactly one kind of person. Someone with large quantities of cash they couldn't explain, who needed it to come out the other side looking like the proceeds of legitimate fashion sales. Mercer built the pipes. Celeste lent the famous name. But the dirty money flowing through it all belonged to someone neither of them had named. Someone with a great deal of unexplainable cash and a reason to route it through Marco Devereaux's clean and trusted house of all the houses in the city. "Think about who'd choose this house," Dahlia said, and now her voice had the particular quiet it got when she was following a seam to its source. "Of every fashion label they could have used, they chose yours. The one with a silent, dangerous owner. That's not convenient. That's insane. Unless it was the point. Unless someone wanted their dirty money washing through a house owned by you specifically. So that if it ever surfaced, it didn't land on them. It landed on Marco Devereaux." She looked at him, and the cold understanding moved between them at the same moment. "This was never just a laundry, Marco. Someone built a year-long scheme to run their filth through your house, using my designs and Celeste's name and Mercer's pipes, so that when the law or your rivals came looking, the trail ended at you, holding a dirty front you didn't know was dirty. Mercer didn't aim this at the house. Someone aimed it at you. The credit theft, the laundering. It's all just the delivery system. You're the target." And in the silence that followed, Marco Devereaux understood that he had walked into this thinking he was a victim of theft, and discovered instead that he was the mark of something far more deliberate. That somewhere out there was a person patient and clever enough to spend a year building an elaborate frame with his name at the bottom of it, using a vain designer, a desperate CFO, and the one genuinely talented woman in the building as unwitting bricks in a wall meant to bury him. The scheme had never been about money. The money was the weapon. He was the wound it was meant to make. "Whoever they are," Dahlia said quietly, "they don't know yet that we've seen it. Mercer's confession made everyone think it's over, which is exactly what they'd want. They think the pipes took the fall, and the water's still hidden." She gathered her folder, her mind already moving the way it moved over a half-finished pattern. "Which gives us one move before they realize we're still looking. We find out whose money it is, and we find out who hates you enough, or wants what you have badly enough, to spend a year and a fortune building a trap this patient. Because that's not a thief, Marco. A thief wants your money. This person wants you gone. And they've been standing close enough to do all this without you ever feeling them there." The frame came down on Dahlia before they were ready, exactly as she'd known it would. And it came, she'd realize, because someone close to Marco had been listening to every move they made. It happened in a single coordinated morning. The house's lawyers, acting on an anonymous internal report, filed to have Dahlia Rourke removed for cause, citing her total access to the designs, her undocumented role, her unexplained private meetings with the investor. Simultaneously, a set of records surfaced that were genuinely devastating. The off-book garment orders, the phantom suppliers, the laundering pipes, all of it digitally signed, authorized, and traced back through credentials that were hers. Someone had spent the night before rebuilding the entire scheme's paper trail to originate from Dahlia's access. The invisible designer, the woman whose hands were on everything and whose name was on nothing, had just been handed a name at last. The name on every incriminating document in the house. She wasn't the scapegoat anymore. She was the confessed architect, in ink, in the system, signed. And Celeste, who had spent 12 years performing genius she didn't have, gave the performance of her life. Tearful,
betrayed, telling anyone who'd listen that she'd trusted her assistant, that she'd had no idea, that the heavy-set woman she'd so generously employed had been robbing the house behind her back the whole time. It was, Dahlia had to admit, even in the middle of it, beautifully done. The world had always been primed to believe that the talent belonged to the pretty one and the crime belonged to the invisible one. The frame didn't have to be convincing. It only had to confirm what everyone already wanted to believe. This was the moment. Dahlia stood in the flagship she had secretly built, surrounded by her own stolen work, with every document in the building pointing at her and a dangerous man watching to see what she'd do. And she felt the old trap door swing open beneath her, the one that had been waiting under 12 years of being unseen. The human thing, the panicked thing, was to protest, to insist she'd been set up, to throw herself on Marco's mercy and beg him to believe her over the mountain of evidence. And she knew, the way she'd always known, that a heavy-set nobody protesting her innocence against signed documents and a weeping beauty would convince exactly no one. So she did the opposite. She went very still, and instead of defending herself, she finished the pattern. "You've framed me beautifully," she said, not to Celeste, not to the lawyers, but turning deliberately to Marco. "And I could spend a week swearing I didn't do it, and it wouldn't move a single person in this room, because I'm exactly who everyone wants the criminal to be. So I'm not going to defend myself. I'm going to show you the one thing the frame can't fake." She crossed to the locked flat file cabinet that only she had ever used and drew out the original sketches, 12 years of them, dated, hand-drawn, every collection's true genesis in graphite, and her own unmistakable hand, with construction notes no one but the true designer could have written, including for garments that hadn't yet been made. Whoever rebuilt the paper trail last night was very good with the financial records, but they couldn't draw. Ascension exists here, in my hand, dated 18 months before it launched. The forger could sign my name to a laundering document. They could not reach back in time and draw the collections before they existed. The designs prove I made the clothes. And if I made the clothes that everyone in this room watched Celeste take credit for, she let it land, then the easiest fact this frame depends on, that I'm a nobody assistant who couldn't possibly be the center of anything, is the first thing that just fell apart. The room went silent. And then, Dahlia did the thing that turned her own exoneration into Marco's salvation, because she'd seen, finally, how the two were the same. "But here's what should frighten you, Marco," she said. "Whoever rebuilt that paper trail did it overnight, the night after we talked, in private, when no one could hear. They knew what we'd found within hours of our finding it. Mercer's in custody. It wasn't him. Celeste isn't capable of it. Someone has been watching your investigation from inside your own circle. Someone who knew you'd come to the launch, knew when you met me, knew exactly when to deploy this frame. The dirty money was never Celeste's and never Mercer's. It belongs to someone close enough to you to have heard every move you made against them, and patient enough to spend a year turning your own house into the noose." She held his gaze. "You've been asking who's robbing your front. Wrong question. Ask who's been close enough to you to do all of this, and who gains everything the day Marco Devereaux goes down holding a dirty laundry he can't explain." And Marco Devereaux, who trusted almost no one, and therefore could count on one hand the people who'd had that kind of access, felt the answer arrive with the sickening weight of the obvious. Only one man had been at his side through all of it. Only one man had known about the launch, had counseled patience, had been quietly positioned to inherit the most if Marco fell. Sebastian Cole, his oldest ally. The partner he'd never once thought to watch, because watching him had never seemed necessary. Which was, Dahlia understood, the entire point. The most dangerous traitor is never the enemy you guard against. It's the friend you stopped checking, because checking him felt like an insult to 20 years of trust. "He used your faith in him as a blind spot," Dahlia said quietly, watching the truth reorganize a man who had built his whole survival on never being surprised. "The same way I used the world's contempt as a hiding place, and Celeste used a borrowed face. Everyone in this story has been hiding behind what other people refuse to look at, Marco. The difference is, I hid to make beautiful things. He hid to take everything you have. And he's about to learn what I learned a long time ago." She set the sketches down. "That the person nobody's watching is the most dangerous one in the room. He just made the mistake of assuming that person was him."
What happened to Sebastian Cole, Dahlia did not entirely witness, and she did not ask. That was settled in Marco's world, by Marco's rules, in rooms she was not in. And she had learned enough about that world by now to understand that some doors you do not open, and some questions you do not make a man answer. What she knew was this: the dirty money was traced, at last, to Cole. The year-long architecture of the frame came apart once they knew whose hand had drawn it, and the trap built to bury Marco Devereaux closed instead on the oldest friend who'd built it. Cole had counted on 20 years of trust as his cover. He had not counted on a designer who knew, better than anyone alive, exactly how a person hides genius, or guilt, behind a face the world has agreed not to question. But the part Dahlia did witness, the part she would remember for the rest of her life, happened 3 weeks later, under lights, in front of the entire industry that had spent 12 years refusing to look at her. The house needed a future. Cole was gone, Mercer was gone, and Celeste. Celeste, it turned out, could not survive 5 minutes of genuine scrutiny once the protective architecture around her collapsed. Asked by a single persistent journalist to sketch a basic bodice on live television, she had frozen, and the freeze had told a story no denial could outrun. The legend cracked in real time. And into that vacuum, Marco Devereaux did the one thing that was both excellent business and something more than business. He announced that the true designer of Ascension, of all of it, every collection the world had wept over for 12 years, would be revealed at a single show. No name in advance, just an invitation, and the whole industry's helpless curiosity. Dahlia almost didn't walk out. She stood backstage in the dark in a dress she had designed for her own body, the first garment she had ever made for herself to be seen in rather than to hide in, and felt every reason she'd spent 12 years in the back room rise up at once. The certainty that the moment they saw her, the spell would break, that the work they loved would curdle the instant it was attached to a woman who looked like her, that she was about to test the one thing she'd built a whole life to avoid testing. And Marco found her there, in the dark, and did not push her, because he'd learned that with her, you never had to. "You don't owe them this," he said quietly. "You can keep the cage if it's safer. I'll back whatever you choose. But I want you to hear one thing before you decide." He waited until she looked at him. "I didn't fall for the clothes, Dahlia. I fell for the woman who made them and let no one know. The work was never the secret worth keeping. You were." And Dahlia Rourke, who had spent 12 years being the truth behind a borrowed face, who had made a cage and called it a strategy, who had been framed and unframed, and seen at last by a man who'd had every tool to look away and refused, understood that the bravest thing she would ever design was the decision to stop hiding. Not because the fear was gone, because the fear, finally, was no longer in charge. She walked out. She walked out under the lights, in front of the buyers who'd shut their doors on her 12 years ago, in front of the press who'd called Celeste a genius, in front of the entire machine that had decided long ago that a woman shaped like her could not be the face of beautiful things.
and she stood beside the final gown of the collection, the masterpiece of ascension, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, "My name is Dahlia Rourke. I designed this. I designed all of it. I've designed every piece this house has shown for 12 years, from a back room, under a name that wasn't mine, because I believed you wouldn't buy beauty from a woman who looked like me." A pause, the whole room utterly silent. I was wrong to hide, but I wasn't wrong about you. Most of you did exactly what I expected for 12 years. So look now. Look at the work, and look at the woman who made it, at the same time, for the first time. And then decide which one of us should have been ashamed. The silence held for 1 second, 2, the longest of her life. And then, somewhere in the back, a single buyer who'd once shut a door on a younger Dahlia began to applaud, and it caught, and it built, and it became the thing she had spent 12 years certain she would never be allowed to have. A room full of the people who'd dismissed her, on their feet, for work they could no longer pretend belonged to anyone else. It was not, Dahlia understood, even as it washed over her, redemption. They didn't deserve to be forgiven that easily, and she didn't intend to let them. But it was something better. It was proof that the work had always been enough, and the hiding had never been necessary, and the only thing that had ever needed to change was her willingness to make them look.
The offer came a week after the show, and Markham made it the way he'd made the first one, directly, on his own terms. Except this time, Dahlia understood that his terms had quietly become a question rather than a command. "The house is yours," he said. "Not the front of it, the whole of it. Creative control, your name on the door, the title, the equity, all of it, in writing, real. I'll stay the investor, silent or not, however you want me. I have spent a fortune over 12 years on a label that was secretly built by one woman, and I'd be a fool to own the building and let the genius walk out of it. Run it. Make it yours. It always was." Dahlia considered him across the same empty restaurant where he'd first told her he knew her secret. And she did not say yes, not immediately, because she had spent her whole life saying yes to arrangements that asked her to be smaller than she was, and she was done with that for good. "Here are my terms," she said, "and they're not negotiable, so listen carefully. The house carries my name and only my name. No more borrowed faces, not even a flattering one. I design what I want, for the bodies the rest of this industry pretends don't exist, including mine. And if that costs us a certain kind of customer, we lose them and I sleep fine. And you," she held his gaze, steady as she'd been the night she identified a seam Celeste couldn't. "You don't get to be the powerful man who rescued the hidden designer. That story isn't true, and I won't wear it. I saved myself. I caught what was aimed at you. I broke the frame. I walked out under those lights on my own legs. If there's going to be something between us, it starts there, with you knowing all the way down that I am not a thing you found and fixed. I'm the most talented person you've ever met who happens to also want you. Those are very different women. Make sure you know which one you're asking for." "I've known since the launch party," Marco said. "I watched you identify a seam a celebrated designer couldn't explain, and I thought, there she is, the only real thing in the room. I didn't come to rescue you, Dahlia. I came to find out who'd been robbing me, and I found the one person alive who's never needed rescuing from anyone." The most dangerous man in the city looked at the most gifted woman in it, and for once in his life, he was not negotiating. "I don't want the woman I fixed. There isn't one. I want the one who walked out under the lights and dared a whole industry to call her ashamed. All of her, on her own name. Those are my terms, too." And Dahlia Rourke, who had spent 12 years as the truth behind a borrowed face, who had built a cage out of the world's cruelty and finally, on her own schedule and nobody else's, walked out of it, closed the distance between them herself,
because she had decided a long time ago that she would never again wait in a back room for someone to come and find her. The kiss, when it came, was not a rescue and not an arrival at the end of someone else's story. It was simply two people who had each spent a lifetime hidden, one behind contempt, one behind power, choosing at last to be seen by the one person who'd looked hard enough to find the real thing underneath. She kissed him on her own name, in her own house, having saved herself first and chosen him second, which was, she'd come to understand, the only order that had ever made her free. They gave her genius to someone prettier for 12 years and called the woman who made it an assistant, because the world had decided what a person who looks like her is allowed to be. And she let them believe it, right up until the day she walked out under the lights and made them look. So tell me in the comments, did you spot the real traitor before she did? Or did the friend fool you too? And here's the question I really want you to sit with. Have you ever hidden something you were proud of because you were afraid of how the world would look at you for it? What would it take to walk out under your own lights? Tell me below. I read every single one. If Dahlia's story meant something to you, do me a favor and subscribe, because the next woman they underestimate is even harder to keep down than this one. I'll see you there.